Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from Altispeed Technologies, the Ask Noah Show starts right now. This is the show where we came to do all the things on Linux they said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. My name is Noah Chalaya. I am your host. Delighted to be here with you as another episode of the Ask Noah Show kicks off this evening. Joining me, my co-host, Mr. Steve Ovens. Welcome in, sir.
Good evening. It's good to be back. I've been kind of chomping at the bit to get back at the show tonight.
Well, that's good. And in preparation for that, you decided to bork your desktop.
Well, something like that, I suppose. I suppose I wouldn't say bork my desktop as much as was looking for a solution for my wife's desktop. Something wasn't quite right, not behaving properly, couldn't quite isolate. The logs are full of errors that are kind of cryptic, and when I threw some LLM, it gave me some generalities, and I thought, I don't really want to deal with this. So we were kind of hopping desktops together, and we landed on the Deepin desktop. So for the last 4 weeks, been running the Deepin desktop. I liked it well enough.
Okay.
Yeah, you know what? It's pretty. I'll give them that. Like it looks good. It is a visually appealing desktop that has a lot of the niceties turned on from someone who normally uses things stock. So it gives you like little notification sounds and it just is, it's a generally really nice looking desktop, but it doesn't quite behave exactly like I want it to. And so I thought, well, I really like the Deepin greeter. I'll just, switch back to GNOME inside the greeter. And that works fine. And in fact, I noticed a performance bump over just using GDM. So some of the little niggles that I have had with GNOME went away just swapping out GDM. However, what I did run into was the desktop does not lock anymore. And I didn't realize that. I walked away and my wife's like, you left your desktop unlocked, which is like really unusual for me. And so I went back and was like, oh, and I started digging through, and it turns out that you can't actually lock the GNOME desktop, at least in the way that I could find, without having GDM as the backend. So I went back to GDM, and that led me down a whole other series of interesting adventures that which don't have time for, but it did provoke a question. I started thinking about, why do we run the Linux desktop? And I thought I would ask Noah, why do you run the Linux desktop, even though we run into all these like little corner cases and bugs and stuff like that?
It's a good question. It's kind of like, why do you want to be a masochist, right? Like, to a degree, well, it feels like that some days. The answer to that question is, for me at least, it comes down to a basic ownership of a skill or a resource. So I divide things into three components. Disposable things, drill bits, toilet paper, paper towels. I have no expectation that they'll be in my life any longer than I need them to accomplish a task, and then they're going to go away, and I'm fine with that. There's services, things that I pay other people to do, mow my lawn, clear the snow, give me a newspaper subscription, stream a thing. Whatever those things are, I have no expectation that they will be there past when I'm done paying the bill. But when it comes to technology, I'm passionate about it. It's a hobby, sure. It's also the way I make my living, so I have a vested interest in being able to eat. But then above and beyond that, it is a life skill and a life resource that I have spent time investing in. And so just like learning a musical instrument or just learning a second language, it is a skill and a resource that I've been blessed with and I've been given. In order to exercise or practice that skill or ability, I need hardware and software that will allow me to do it on my own the way I want to do it. And so if I want to change out my login manager, I should be able to do that. If in my own process of trying to put a pear and an apple together, I make a terrible salad, that isn't, so far as I see it anyway, isn't really a reflection on the quality of software, lack thereof, from the places that I got the pear and the apple from. It's my fault for putting those two things together, and it didn't quite work out the way that I want it to. What I found over time is that Linux is the only operating system that if you hand me a processor and some memory and a storage device and a display device and a keyboard and a mouse and a system board and a power source and handed all those things to me and said, Noah, put this together and do something with it, I would struggle to do that with any other operating system unless you also add an internet connection in there, right? I'm not going to be able to build a Macintosh computer and get Mac OS loaded onto it, nor am I going to be able to sign into Windows 11 anymore without an internet connection. And so the mainstream world is going one direction. They want technology as a service. I understand that. I am working overtime at my small IT company to get IT as a service to where the need is, where people want it. But as far as myself, as far as people that are like me, that are fellow geeks, I have absolutely no interest in handing that skill or ability off to somebody else and paying for it as a service. I want to own it. How about you?
Yeah, I've been giving this a lot of thought, and I'd like to give some philosophical answer about free software and that sort of stuff. But ultimately, I guess it really comes down to the fact that I don't like having to say, I don't know why this is doing the thing. Right? I don't. That's a very
Steve answer.
And I've used Windows for a significant period of my life, not recently. So we're talking Windows 7 and before. And I didn't find that to be the case. Like when you run into problems, you can't really swap out parts if you wanted to, right? If when the Windows breaks, you have a broad community, right? There are some big pluses there. There's a big community around trying to fix and troubleshoot Windows, and just a general support group there. And that's good. But if you run into a case where you hit a bug and you can't get around this bug, there's nothing you can do about it. Mm-hmm. So here's your for instance, right? The reason why we started hopping desktops for my wife was because she started to have a problem with one of the games where the game would just stutter. And so I'm sure I mentioned it. I basically threw money at this problem, and I bought brand new everythings. The only thing that's the same is the case, because it's pink, down to new monitors, right? That didn't solve the problem. So we started swapping out. She was hitting some very specific bugs that there's just nothing that I can do about it, short of like getting in, and I don't have the wherewithal or the time to go and learn C at the level I needed to work around this problem. But I can swap out the underlying issue, which is it's primarily an issue with the display manager, but that also is directly tied in with the desktop environment. See my previous comments, right? So couldn't really do that on Windows. There are plenty of times where you see somebody has ran into a bug and they just can't get around it. And it's just like, people are like, I'm sorry, you have a bug, and maybe there's something that's been filed, but you basically have to wait. And I don't like that. So
that's a good reason. So
I'd be interested to hear from the audience in general. If you're using Linux, why are you using it? And I would kind of like to, I'd be interested to be able to kind of make some sort of general statement of like, hey, 30% of our audience thinks of like this. So I'd like to be able to make some broad categories for why people are using Linux out there.
80% of our audience is a masochist, and the remaining 20% have some sort of work-related purpose that they are forced into it. No, that's probably not right. We should do away with that. Hey, Steve, should we answer some questions?
Let's do it.
Our first email tonight comes in from Don. Don writes in and says, I was introduced to your podcast today. I listened to Ask Noah 331 regarding Graphene OS. I have a Pixel 6a, which I plan to install it on, but I also have a Librem 5 phone. I'm considering installing Postmarket OS on that. I'm not happy with the progress of Pure OS. You mentioned that you had some issues with Postmarket OS. I would appreciate it if you could either point me to the episode where you cover them or send an email that lays them out. If you have an alternative suggestion in which you consider better, please share it. Thank you so much for all of your work. I think your podcast is the absolute best thing for people who want to learn and grow. Kind regards, Dawn. So, Steve, if you were advising, well, let me back up, give you some setup. So this week, I am perusing through my phone, and as I am perusing through my phone, I come across a game called Blocks. And I'm thinking to myself, Blocks, Steve, I don't play Blocks. I don't even have games on my phone. How did this game get on my phone? And as I'm looking further, it's not just Blocks that were on my phone. It's actually a whole list of like 15 apps that are on my phone, to include TikTok, by the way. And I thought, how in the Jiminy Crickets did apps get installed on my phone? Did I get hacked? So I go to the Googleator and I throw in Samsung S10 app stream, and I'll be darned if AT&T did not release an update that uses their mobile service carrier to install all of these apps I didn't want on my phone. See our previous discussion about things being a tool, a resource, or a service? It very much feels like the thing is rented, and I will not miss an opportunity to say that I bought the Samsung S10 with the very expressed intent of flashing Lineage OS when Samsung or AT&T stopped pushing software updates to it, only to find out that they made two versions, an international version and a US version, and the US version is a locked bootloader. You can't install Lineage OS. So, with that soapbox out of the way, what would you recommend to Don?
I mean, I'm not really sure about Pure OS because I've not actually used it. I haven't really had any major problems with Graphene OS, but one of the things I would say is, as a long time Linux user, like 20 plus years, I am fairly tolerant of rough edges. You know, I started using Linux back in the day where drivers and printers and stuff like that had to be unpacked from an exe and run through something called NDIS wrapper, and maybe it worked and maybe it didn't, and like, so I have an extreme tolerance for pain when it comes to this sort of stuff, and so I haven't run into anything where I would call it a deal breaker with Graphene OS, especially if you're willing to put in a little bit of a learning, right? So by default, I'll give you for instance, I think I may have shared this before. When I first started using Graphene OS, the Marriott app for the hotel, first of all, the very first time I tried to install it, it claimed that I had rooted my device and it wasn't going to run on a rooted device. Goodbye. Then a few months later, I fired it up again. Like, I uninstalled it after it told me that. And then I installed it later and it would just crash to the desktop with no particular, like no notation whatsoever. And then recently I noticed that it was belching SE Linux errors, which just happens to be something that I'm well enough versed in. I read the error. I'm like, I know how to fix this. How do I do this? So I did the, translation of like, hey, Mr. Internet, how do I translate this SE Linux thing into an option for Graphene OS? And once I did that, the Graphene OS worked fine. And I was able to apply that to some other apps that were not functioning properly. So if you're willing to work through a little bit of it, or you turn all of the Graphene OS stuff off, which I don't know why you would run Graphene over Lineage. To make the transition, to make that a smooth transition. That's why you would do that. But why would you do that over Lineage, I guess, is my point.
That's a trickier question. So to your point, I have had Oh, okay. Let me back up. So the episode in which we talked about post-market OS is 368. I'll have it linked for you in the show notes at podcast.asknoahshow.com, but it's podcast.asknoahshow.com/368. How easy is that? The Lineage OS, I would say, is if you have a degooglified version of Lineage OS, you're 80% of the way there to Graphene OS. Graphene OS is for the paranoid of the paranoid. It's for the people that want control over absolute everything. I'll give you an example. One of the things that Graphene OS does, that now knowing that I have this option, I can't go back to without it, is I can deny network privileges to apps. Now, apps will lose their ever-loving mind if you take their internet access away, but you have the opportunity to do that. The other thing that Graphene OS allows you to do is spoof data to the app. So it says, I need location data. And you say, I'm not giving you location data. Well, then I'm not going to run. Well, fine. I'll turn on location data and I'll just make up stuff. And then you'll have location data. And then the app goes, okay, well, I'm happy. And it doesn't care that it's being fed garbage data, but it's also not violating your privacy. So you get those kind of levers that you can control if you care about that, or if you care about the fact that there is a specific security chip built into the Pixel that the Graphene OS operating system takes advantage of so that it can't be attacked by a government level attacker who's going to try to steal the private keys to decrypt the phone. If you have that level of threat, Graphene OS is your baby all day long. And there really isn't anything else on the planet that does what Graphene OS does. However, if you're just looking for, I want something better than stock Android, I want something more privacy respecting than just an Apple iPhone, Lineage OS is great. It comes with a lot of the same advantages of Graphene OS, none of the pain points. Here, to Steve's point, if you shut off a lot of the things that make Graphene OS, you can start with a full-on Google Play, install all your apps, sign into all of the accounts, do all the things. Yes, you're giving up some of those privacy decisions, but you have the ability to turn those levers back off 6 months down the road once you get everything kind of ironed out and solidified. So that would be a reason to go that direction. Otherwise, yeah, especially if you already have a Pixel, that's where I would start. The other thing is, as far as getting it onto the phone, I would argue Graphene OS is maybe the easiest operating system I've ever installed on a phone. You know why? You open Chrome, you plug a USB cable in, and you click next a bunch of times on their website, and it walks you through exactly what to do. And by the time you get done, you have Graphene OS on your phone. So that's what I would do. You feel free to check out episode 368 if you want more information on post-market OS, but I would tell you it's not quite there yet as a daily driver. Our second email comes in, Noah and Steve, I have been researching using Proxmox with OpenSense VM and other VMs for a lab setup. I found different theories on the safety of this method. Could I get your opinion? Basically, what I'm trying to decide is this method safe, or is it safer to have OpenSense on a separate hardware other than VMs? Thanks for your time and keep up the great podcast. What do you think, Steve? Is he opening himself up to a security problem?
Not really. I mean, I would keep it separate. So I've gone down this route for sure, although not with Proxmox, just with straight up KVM. Mm-hmm. I've been down this route. There's no real problem with it because if you're passing the NIC in anyways, the host OS is not seeing that traffic, and there's no real way for somebody to breach the host OS because that's just not how the hardware gets dedicated to the VM. I prefer a standalone box, but I know lots of people that do this.
Our third email comes in from Marcus. Marcus says, Noah and Steve, great show. I love listening to all the information that you share with others. Now it's my turn to ask a question. Everyone always seems to talk about secure operating systems with respect to internet traffic. What about file systems? If your computer is stolen or gets lost during travel, it doesn't matter if you have the greatest firewall configured on the planet. Somebody can pull your drive out from your machine and attempt to access it. I'm not worried about being hacked online. I'm worried about somebody accessing my data if they have my drive in their hands. I know that with some issues by some vendors in the past, so that's not even a guarantee. But what about file systems? I know that drives can be encrypted with LUKS. How secure is that really? What about encryptions with other file systems like TrueCrypt, VeriCrypt? Can you make KDE vaults? Or just make large, sparse file and encrypting with LUKS and formatting it as a block device? If you're going to store the most precious memories and personal, medical, and financial information on a drive, or store it in a remote file location following the 321, how would you secure the data on that drive? Steve, take a stab at it.
LUKS all day. ZFS encryption is great too. No issue there, but everything that I do is via LUKS. The only thing I would mention, so he mentions like how secure is it? I don't believe there's any kind of timeout in terms of like if someone stole your disk and then started to try and brute force the password, I don't know that there's any protection against that. But at the same time, LUKS is, as long as you've picked something decent for a password, not 1234, you probably are going to deter the majority of people unless it's a targeted attack.
Here's the other side of that. So there may not be a timeout functionality per se, and maybe there isn't, we don't know about it. So I mean, I throw that out there. Don't want to irritate the LUKS people. But the other thing that LUKS allows you to do, when you enter that passphrase, you're not actually decrypting the drive. What you're doing is unlocking the key that is then stored that then unlocks the drive. So if you want to prevent the ability from somebody to brute force it, you can actually remove the key from the drive altogether. So if they steal the drive, they're only getting the encrypted drive. The key ain't even on there. So they can bang away at their keyboard till the cows come home, and there's not a key on there to decrypt. The downside to doing that is you have to manually load the key when you want to decrypt LUKS, but the functionality is there. Additionally, what that gets you is you can have different passphrases secure the key, so you can have multiple people have access to the same drive. And so that's the way you ask, what do you do with the most sensitive private information you have? This is a real thing I've dealt with in my house, right? If something happens to me, I get hit by a bus, I want my wife to be able to get into all of the things that get us into banks and company and you know, moments and all the things that you want to store somewhere, but you don't want anybody to get to them. The way that I accomplish that securely and with a 321 method is I have it in 3 places. It's on 3 separate drives. Those drives are never, ever, 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 ever connected to a machine with an internet connection. There's a dedicated computer that's used for accessing them. And it's encrypted with both LUKS, and then inside of LUKS, I have another container. You can choose what you like. You could use VeriCrypt. For me, I really am a fan of just plain old GPG because I know how to use it, and it just makes me comfortable. It's like I don't know. It's like a comfortable shoes. I don't know. But so I store it in there, and so you'd have to if there was the off chance that there was some sort of secure vulnerability with Lux, you would get through the front door, but you wouldn't be able to get into the inner sanctum, so to speak. And so that's kind of the way that I've addressed that, and I keep them all offline, and just once a month or once every few months, whenever I make changes, I shuffle all the cards down the deck and make sure that I've got duplicates on all of those drives. So that's what I'd recommend. I couldn't agree more with Steve. Go with Lux. Our third email comes in from Jim. Jim writes in and he says, "Hi, Noah and Steve. Thanks for all the work you do. I really enjoy the show. In regards to your powering a 65-watt laptop in episode 393, I've been powering my little home office with a pedal power generator since 2010. While it might be technically feasible to generate 65 watts while working on your laptop, I think you'd find it difficult. I average about 50-watt output for the 4 or 5 hours I pedal each day. For what it's worth, I'm 59. Younger people could probably generate more watts than I can. If you decide to go off the grid with a pedal power generator, I suggest replacing your laptop with something more efficient. I use a fanless mini PC running Debian 12 with a 16-inch Scepter LED model. The two combined draw 11 watts. That gives me enough surplus to power my inkjet printer, charge our phones, and charge the AA, AAA batteries that we use in the lights around our home. And the power to fiber the home optical network terminal with a Pi router and web server. These require the most energy since they're on 24/7. It's definitely not the easiest or cheapest way to generate electricity. Using solar panels would be much more cost effective, but it allows me to generate electricity regardless of the conditions outside, giving me plenty of exercise every day. So I have to tell you, in the 397 episodes we've done, that might be one of my favorite pieces of feedback ever. The guy is literally doing what we joked about. If you missed the episode, I was talking about doing a physical therapy appointment in which they had a bicycle that, to appease my ADD mind, had a screen to tell me how much power I was generating. He's actually doing that to power stuff. That's pretty cool, Steve. I think he's got you beat with your solar panels.
I would say he's got me beat from the end of the world sort of thing. His method will keep working absent some sort of mechanical failure.
Yours makes it slightly easier to type. Yeah, and it's less intrusive, I would say. Our fourth email comes in from Ziggy. Ziggy writes in and says, "Hi guys, my second time to write in. I continue to love the show, and most importantly, I find it useful. I've been burned by a well-known central heating automation system in which it lost its network connection, a problem that I never got to the bottom of. The system remained at the last timer setting, hence woke several times at 3 a.m. to discover the heating was still on, and the only way I could turn it off was to flick the fuse board supply to switch it off. My understanding is that if the heating has been shut off, the network connection went down, and then heating would have remained shut down. However, this particular scenario, that never occurred. So I've been investigating options. Having rid myself of that system and installed a dumb timer as a stopgap, I've begun the Home Assistant journey. Running the OS on a Pi 4, I simply have a few lights and temperature sensors on it at present, but I would like to run my heating system on it. I understand that it's possible, but I can't quite figure out how to do it. The heating boiler has 3 wires on the wall, live, neutral, and these are from the main supplies, and then there's a single black wire that feeds the boiler through a switch. The thing I can't quite work out is if I were to buy, say, a Shelly switch that would be controlled via Zigbee, how do I wire that? It sounds like it's pretty simple, but it really has me stumped. So, Steve, how do you do HVAC?
Well, absent of looking at it, it sounds like all you need is a dry contact. So what that means is there's 2 different ways that the Shellys work. So one way is I take power in, and that power powers the device and also flows through the Shelly into your load-bearing thing, whatever that is. That will provide you power monitoring. That's probably not what you want because the Shelly needs to be powered. So it sounds like it's very similar to how my fireplace works. And what a dry contact does is you power the Shelly via some means, whether it's 12 volts DC or you plug it into your AC or whatever it is, right? But that power does not pass through the Shelly. Then in a separate section, what it does is it basically acts as touching the 2 wires together in order to complete the circuit. And it sounds like you have the power come in, and then the Shelly will trigger the bridge and allow the power to flow through and out the other side. It sounds to me like what needs to happen is the power from your from your mains comes into one side of the dry contact and out through the other wire, the other black wire. Because it sounds to me like the other black wire is what's actually feeding the board. And then the neutral wire also gets plugged into the Shelly, and that would complete the circuit. You have to check your manual on your thing, because you could end up sending, your AC power right down and blow up your circuit board if that's not how it's supposed to be done, right? But yeah, that's what I would think generally.
So typically on any sort of home heating system, it's going to typically be controlled by a thermostat of sorts. And so if you go down to your heating and air conditioning system, you should see a couple of wires. You should see a black wire or a blue wire, and it'll be labeled C, or it'll be plugged into a contact label C. Then you should see your thermostat wire. That's going to be a red wire, and it'll be labeled R or RC. And then you'll have a white wire, and that's typically labeled W1 or W2. Sometimes the color codes will match, sometimes they won't. Depends on if it was retrofit, all the things. But oftentimes what you can do, heating systems are not typically that complicated. There's a call for heat, and when it calls for heat, then it turns on and runs. It sounds like what you're doing is cycling the AC power so that it comes on and the thermostat's stuck to calling for heat, and so then that runs. And so if you're going Steve's direction, then it works, right? It gets you there, but I think there's maybe an in-between step. The other thing is, you mentioned the word boiler. If you're using a boiler system, that is to say there's a tank, it heats up the water, then there's a pump that pumps it around, and then it goes into radiators, and that's what you're heating your house. If that's the way it's working, you don't really want to be shutting it off and on via AC, because what's going to happen is you need that pump to circulate the water around enough that it can keep the boiler up to temp. And then when there's a call for heat at a specific area, it opens the flow valve, and the heat runs over to that area of the house. But my suggestion to you would be, take a look around and see if you can find where those thermostats are wired in, or more importantly, what they call the equipment interface module, or the thing that connects directly to your furnace. You should see those wires, the C wire, RC, W1, W2. Look for those, and then you can look up a simple wiring diagram as to how to make your call for heat, or you can buy like a Zigbee or Z-Wave powered thermostat. Any of those would be the way I would address that. Now, Steve, this is interesting because he's dealing with these issues. You had an interesting issue with your home automation this week.
Yeah, it raises the question. When I was reading this email, it really raised the question of, how do you deal with critical infrastructure failure, especially when you've taken on the automation. Now, in this case, it sounds like the automation system was not a DIY, but comes from the manufacturer, but it still failed. And the question is still valid. What do you do when you have an automation failure on a critical piece of infrastructure, like your heating, like your air conditioning, anything like that is, what we would consider critical in modern day? So for me, I am not having individual problems with a specific component, but rather a bunch of the stuff that connects over the 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi is having problems for me. And when I was considering, well, what do you normally do about this? Well, you read, then you ask smarter people than you, and then problem is solved. I've done the first two, and my problem's still not solved. And if you could see me, I would be staring directly at Noah.
Me?
So Noah is the smarter person. But in seriousness, though, you normally reach out to your community and you attempt to get a solution from your community as to, what's going on. Somebody smarter than me can help interpret this for whatever it is. So, you need to have some sort of, some idea before you put it in place, how you fall back. And in our case, most of the house is just set up so that, you walk over to a switch and you toggle the switch. Or in the case of it not being a switch, so I have my monitors attached to this system. And what happens is, if the power in my computer is really low, it assumes that the computer's gone to sleep and it turns the monitors off. Well, the problem is that the power is really low if the thing monitoring the power drops off the network. And so my monitors were being turned off. And the fallback there is I put a little thing in Home Assistant, which is an override that says, hey, if this is on, don't bother firing the automation. So it's really key to think about these things ahead of time so that when you have a failure, you have some sort of path of recovery.
So 100%, especially the have a path of recovery. So the way that I've gone about doing that in my home, everything is its own independent thing. No one thing relies on any other thing. So the lights operate completely independent of anything else. The HVAC operates completely independent of anything else. Access control operates independent of anything else. Cameras operate independent. You get the idea. And Home Assistant then stitches all of the individual things together. So it has happened. A power failure goes, whatever. And in my house, there's a very specific order that things really need to boot up in. It's not like a hard and fast thing, but just I find there's an order where everything is in its happy place. And if that doesn't happen, weird things, it exhibits weird behavior. And so the way that I've gone about fixing that is nothing is ever installed where it relies on one thing in order for that function to happen. So the bedroom lights come on when I walk over to push the lights, whether or not Home Assistant can see them, whether or not. And so kind of siling those things off and then having backup plans, I think is absolutely the right approach. One of the things I'm going to do, I'm going to post in the Geek Lab some photos. A friend of mine is building an interesting concept. He basically took a Pi Zero and combined it with the innards of a Stream Deck, and he's turning it into a light switch that you can use for things like home. It's a poor man's Crestron system, basically. And so it allows you to put these things in the wall and then have little buttons that you can then control locally right from the Pi, other devices, which seems like just could be a useful thing to have there. But yeah, my answer to that would be have an override.
From the Linux Newswire newsroom, this is the Week in Review with JT.
For the week of June 30th, 2024, here's the Linux and open source news. Debian 12.6 is out. A new Endeavour OS release is available, now with Plasma 6.1. Leap Micro 6.0 is available. Leap Micro is a rebranded SUSE Linux Enterprise Micro 6, which is an ultra-reliable container and virtual machine host by SUSE. Pipewire 1.2 is out. OpenShot 3.2 has been released. The Wine team has announced the release of Wine 9.12. And the kernel powering Microsoft Windows subsystem for Linux 2 has long been using the Linux 5.5 LTS kernel. It's now finally upgraded to the current Linux 6.6 LTS series. In security news, a severe vulnerability in OpenSSH's server has been uncovered by Qualia's Threat Research Unit, potentially affecting over 14 million Linux systems worldwide. Security researchers have also discovered vulnerabilities in an open-source software project that could have been exploited to hack thousands of iOS and macOS apps. The threat involves CocoaPods, which programmers use to incorporate existing software libraries into their apps. A new CISA report finds that most open-source projects contain memory unsafe code. And lastly, Andreas Kling of the Serenity OS project has announced the Ladybird Browser Initiative, a US 501c3 nonprofit to drive work on a new cross-platform browser.
Adam Kennedy, he is a senior network program.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for taking the time to be here. It all started when I was headed into my garage and my light wasn't working. It was flickering up above. And I thought to myself, how did I get here? And the way that I got there was I went to the hardware store and I bought some cheap Chinese LED fixture and I screwed it to my ceiling, and it was an abysmal failure. It was terrible. It didn't work at all. And a year later, it's not only did it fail, Steve, it's flickering. Okay, so it's like flashing, which I didn't think was a problem because originally I was like, well, whatever. I opened the big garage door. Light comes in, it's fine. I'm not in there at night a whole lot, so it'll be all right. Until I was in there at night, and then it wasn't all right. And so I sat down and I said, well, I've got to fix this, but I don't have the time or budget to go through and replace this light fixture. I just did that a year ago. I'm not really in the mood to do it again. And I go digging around in my bin of parts, and I come across some LEDs that I'd purchased to replace in my car. And they're made from a company called M4. You can learn more at m4products.com. They have bulbs specifically designed for being left on for long periods of time and to run through things like power surges. They have quality chips. The design of their cages are superior to most other bulbs on the market. They contract and import directly, which keeps the costs low. So they try to aim for that $25 or less bulb. They also offer 10 to 30 volt rated bulbs, so you don't have the bulb meltdown or the components meltdown anytime there's power surges. They contract through a SEMA member, And of course, they also design and warranty everything inside of the United States. So when I have a problem, which I've never had, I could reach out to them in California or just stop in their shop, which I think is great. And so they have a circuit that protects the LED that is more susceptible to failure. And that's why they oversize the components so that they can handle the heat and they can handle the power environments. And if you look at lesser LEDs, they don't have those things. The other thing that's important to me as a ham radio operator, we typically have problems with LED lights. They create all sorts of noise in the AM and low band spectrum. And M4 makes bulbs that they're properly grounded, they're on the same circuit, and they have circuits that are shielded, so they try to match the capacitance to minimize those effects. So I purchased these bulbs. I love them. I use them in my RV, in my cars, every place that I need LEDs. And I had ordered the wrong kind, and so I just thrown them in a bin. So I took them and I cowboyed some wires onto them and stuck it to a battery and threw it up above my workbench, and I had light. And it got me thinking about this idea of I want to own the ability at this point to put a light up, because apparently I've lost that ability to light my way. And so I got this light up and I started thinking, well, it's running off of this battery for now. Wouldn't it be cool if I could run it off of my Type-C Inu battery? So if you haven't heard about the Inu, I'll have a link for you in the show notes, podcast.asknoahshow.com. But basically, it is a 140 watt power bank that offers USB-C power delivery, which is important because if you're powering a laptop, you definitely want 140 watts. And so, but the problem was these lights are 12 volt lights. So how do you get 12 volts out of, from this USB-C thing? And so I started thinking about it. You know what? I don't own USB-C. That's not something that I can do anything with. I'm incumbent upon a manufacturer to design me a connector or a thing or a bob or a boob to be able to connect these things together. And if that doesn't exist, then I'm unable to do it. And so I started looking, because if I want to produce 12 volts, I don't want just a little, 2 amp thing that can power a light. I want to be able to drive a radio. I want to be able to drive my laptop. I want some power. So I went digging and I found what is known as a 12 volt trigger. I'll have a link for you to the specific brand that I purchased from @RIP. And basically this is a 100 watt 12 volt out trigger. So basically you feed it USB-C power in. There's a little button that you can configure at what you want to ask Type-C for. Do you want to ask it for 15 volts, 20 volts, that sort of thing? And then it steps it down and gives you 12 volt out at 100 amps. So I was able to connect it to my 2 meter and broadcast the Monday Night Net on my 2 meter mobile ham radio running off of a Type-C battery pack. Then I took that Type-C battery pack out to the garage, plugged it into my little 3.5 watt LED light, and I was able to light my garage. And so both of those things are in the category of you want to own 12 volt products, you want to own 12 volts, here's the way to do that. If you want to be able to take that from USB-C, here's the way to do that. And now I'm kind of stuck on this little thing of I want to try and assemble all of these little things together so that I can go and take 12 volts from all over my house. It's just absolutely fantastic. And I'm really happy about it. So that was my success for the week. I'll share it in the show notes, podcast.asknoahshow.com. The Supreme Court correctly found that social media platforms like newspapers, bookstores, and art galleries before them have First Amendment rights to curate and edit speech of others they deliver to their users. This is the headline from the EFF this week. They're talking about a Supreme Court decision in which the Supreme Court looked at Florida's SB 7072 and Texas's House bill that seemingly were in opposition to each other. So they were enacted in different states. And what happened was in the Florida case, it was overturned by a district court. In the Texas case, it was upheld. And so they came to the Supreme Court and said, what do you want us to do with this? We don't understand. And basically what the Supreme Court told them in a 9-0 decision is, better luck next time, try again. And so they came out and said, listen, you guys did not correctly think about how free speech on a platform works. Now, the Santa Clara University law professor, a guy by the name of Eric Goldman, told the Register that the Supreme Court's guidance means that most, if not all, of Florida and Texas social media laws are likely to be disallowed. Quote, most importantly, the majority emphatically rejected the notion that states can dictate or override private content moderation decisions, treating internet services more like a newspaper publisher than a telephone or other common carrier. States around the country are flooding the zone with new internet censorship laws, many of which are predicated on the same misguided and censorial assumptions that inform the Texas and Florida law, he said. I really, really like the way that EFF frames this next to an art gallery. So my thoughts are pretty straightforward. The EFF is comparing it to an art gallery. I think it's an excellent illustration. If I host a thing, if I build a thing, if I set up a thing, if I set up a Mastodon instance, a Matrix server, or whatever it is, and I stand it up, I and I alone should choose what I can put on my thing that I set up. If you want to be on my thing, and I let you come on my thing, and you put something on my thing that I don't like, I should be able to remove it because it's my thing. If you want to put something up on your thing, you go set up a thing. And if I want to promote a specific viewpoint, or I want to steer my thing in a specific direction that perfectly aligns with my values, I should have the ability to do that. And if you don't like that, you go start your own thing, and we'll see who's. I don't understand really the desire to control other people's things, Steve.
So I guess the challenge here is that they try to play both sides of the fence, right? Where they claim that they're not responsible for the posts that people put on them, but then they end up playing editorial by removing posts because it violates community policies or whatever. It's one or the other. You're either responsible or you're not responsible. Mm-hmm. If you're responsible, I fully support what you just said, and there's no need to restate it. If you're not responsible for the stuff that people have said, then you leave their posts alone.
Could it not be that I don't want to be involved enough to be responsible for what other people are saying, so they are going to post what they are going to post, their opinions of their own? As I catch it and disagree with it or don't like it, I will remove it. So you hold the person responsible for what they posted on my platform, and you leave me alone if I wish to remove something that somebody posted on my platform. Could two things be true at one time?
Not really in this case, because of the way that they are, the way that the laws are written with the regards to content publishing versus editorialization. And while you could say, well, they can coexist, you should be able to disallow people from making the other type of claim, right? So if you're going to claim protections because you have editorial rights, fine, right? But then you can't claim that you also have no responsibility for the stuff that's on your platform because you just took responsibility for the stuff on your platform.
By keeping somebody else off.
Right. If you're going to moderate, that's fine. That's your choice. But if you're going to moderate, then you moderate. And you can't just say, well, we don't actually have any responsibility here.
Do you think that any sort of a form without any moderation is even possible?
I don't know. What do you think?
I think that I have a pretty light-handed approach when it comes to moderation. Like, it takes a lot to tip over the bar for me because I come from the premise that we're all consenting adults. And so if you see something you don't like, put on your big boy pants or your big girl pants and scroll past it. It has a power button. The device that you have has a power button, and you are in control. You have the power. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for people that get bent out of shape if they see something they don't like. However, the amount of times that I see something that is so blatantly over the line, like disgusting, terrible, scum of the earth, buried under the prison kind of stuff, if every once in a while some of those people will get into the Geek Lab and post something that is just absolutely vile. And my only irritation is that I didn't see it fast enough to wipe it off the planet fast enough and boot them out of the room fast enough. Now, this is coming from the guy that just told you I have a very light-handed approach to moderation. I'm not the person that goes and feels like you should crawl, into a thing and cry if somebody said something that hurt your feelings or you didn't like. And yet, in my own chat room, I struggle to keep people who want to harm other people, who actively want to harm people by the content or the way that they're posting things. I struggle to keep those people down. And my answer has largely been to empower people in the community so that we can react faster. And that's the best I have. And so when I hear the idea that either that I would be responsible for those things, the answer would be pretty simple. We just wouldn't have them because I wouldn't take on that responsibility knowing what is afloat. The other option is to moderate. And then it comes down to the personal belief of whoever is in charge of that platform, doesn't it?
Yes, I suppose so. But So when we're making a distinction between like a moral responsibility and a legal responsibility, where someone
Sure.
comes to sue you. So for example, like the big tech industry is different than Noah's chat room because it's highly unlikely that any sort of substantive action is going to be taken against you because of something that has happened in the chat room. Whereas people are always blaming big tech for, they needed to be harder on this subject, or, they need to do more to protect us and all that kind of stuff. Right. Mm-hmm. And so when you're facing a substantive responsibility that the public is placing upon you, you need to pick a side as to which one you fall down on. You can't play both sides of the fence and say, well, we don't like the opinions of this person, so we're going to pull it down. But at the other hand, we're also not responsible for the stuff that people are posting on the service. It's one or the other. In my estimation, it's kind of black and white. When there is a violation of law that is different, right? If you've got hate speech laws in your country or something of the like, you are compelled to follow the law with regards to what is acceptable. There are laws in the United States about what is a threat, and threatening people's lives and so on is not protected free speech. Mm-hmm. You need to comply with those. Outside of those laws that are set up in the country, you decide, are you being editorial and pushing forward a viewpoint, which is your prerogative, or are you not?
So that's an interesting thought. So it sounds like there is room in your mind for some moderation. It's just, you would say moderation comes at the behest of the law. If the law in the country or place of origin says, here is the line, then that's the line that we respect because we're legally obligated to follow that line. And you would separate the personal decision part out of it. Or if you're going to make a moral decision, then that's where you would say, well, fine, now you're editorializing. Now it's not based on law or a hard thing that somebody can look and say, am I on the left side of the line or the right side of the line? Now you're saying, it's my personal belief, it's my personal opinion, therefore you become responsible for everything on the site.
Well, that's just kind of the way that it works, right? Like if you are going to discriminate against people's, I'll say free speech in quotations because I'm not sure how much free speech applies to the fact that you're using someone's private server. But if you're going to curtail speech in any facet with an even hand, as in like I'm going to apply some test against people and just ban these people who fail the test, then you are editorializing. You are saying this is the viewpoint that is acceptable on my platform, and it no longer becomes an area where people can exchange knowledge. It becomes an area where people who have or abide by a similar thought process are welcome to converse, and those are different things.
It's a lot to process. What do you think? Write in live at asknoahshow.com. Where do you think this leads? Because one of the, especially with this audience, I mean, my gosh, we have the technical abilities to set these things up, right? The problem, the glaring problem, the million mountain high problem is network effect, right? You can go set up a Mastodon instance. You can go set up, you name the commercial product. There's an open source alternative, but if you're trying to get a message out there, you're trying to reach a place, there's entire businesses that are going to cease to exist if the United States takes a stance that bans TikTok or tries to force it into private ownership, a thing that got significantly less likely, by the way, after the Supreme Court decision. So this has huge, huge potential effects across the tech industry. But I'd be interested in where people fall down on this. Is it something that you'd say, hey, this is something that I think these companies are wronging me? Or do you take the approach that, you know what, if they set up a thing and they want to run it that way and I don't like it, I just won't participate. And if I think that I'm being treated unfairly, well, I wouldn't want to do business and or use a service or a product that treats me poorly. And so I'm just not going to do those. And largely, I don't think it affects you or I in our day-to-day lives because neither one of us have a huge presence on social media or these things. So it's just interesting as the landscape is shifting. Speaking of the landscape shifting, the U.S. Supreme Court today, well, not today, but they ruled that judges should no longer be able to defer to government agency interpretation of ambiguous law. Instead, the decision with potential ramifications for some of the biggest cases against tech companies. It's known as the Chevron Doctrine, and it dates back to 1984 when the court ruled that Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, that the United States Environmental Protection Agency could define ambiguous terms in government like legislation, provided the agency was trying to apply the law as Congress originally intended them to. Well, last week, that decision got reversed. 40-year precedent was reversed. And in doing so, they took up a case, Relentless Inc. versus the Department of Congress, about whether the U.S. Marine Fisheries Service could force U.S. fishing vessels to pay the wages of federal observers in the absence of specific rules speaking to that effect. Quote, the Administrative Procedure Act requires courts exercise their independent judgment in deciding whether an agency has acted within its statutory authority, and courts may not defer to an agency's interpretation of the law simply because the statute is ambiguous. Chevron is overturned, the judges said in a 6-2 majority vote. Now, Justice Alina Kagan, the dissenting opinion, joined Justice Sonia Sotomayor, characterizing the ruling as a judicial power grab because she said it invites judges to make determinations previously trusted to government agencies and expert staff. So this is it's literally a game of 52 card pickup. We've fanned all the cards out, thrown them up in the air and said, okay, let's see where they all land. I think there's going to be some positive things. I think there's going to be some negative things, but this has FTC written all over it, who is engaged, for example, in fights with Adobe over software subscription. All of the big AI players, all of them are going to be dealing with antitrust lawsuits. And so this challenges all of that. Silicon Valley non-compete agreements, all of this stuff is going to get challenged with the Chevron being dismissed. And it could have some real huge effects in the tech industry. Any thoughts?
I think you summed it up quite well.
Yeah.
It is. Wait, time will tell.
The last thing I want to leave you with, we don't spend a lot of time on this, but Matrix had the latest update to Element X. And one of the things that is out now with Element X Nightly is the ability to sign in via a QR code. So no more password, no more entering the server, no more entering the passphrase in order to get the encryption keys to sync and all of the things. Literally, you pull out your phone, you say scan QR code, you scan a device that is already signed in, it pops up and gives you a 2-digit code. You type in that 2-digit code and boom, you're in. It syncs all your messages. It does all your encryption keys. It does everything with a simple QR code scan. And if there's one huge pitfall of a step with onboarding people to Element, it is absolutely encryption. The biggest blessing that Element has to offer is encryption, true end-to-end encryption by default. The biggest pain in the tuchus is end-to-end encryption, true end-to-end encryption by default, because it is the stumbling block for so many people. So the ability to sign in with the QR code, yeah, I think that's going to make it much, much easier. The only thing I wish you could do for the very first device, you could scan in with the QR code without having to authenticate against another device. I recognize there's some security vulnerabilities in there, but what it would allow people to do is to have a card or a thing, and the first device that they're onboarded with, they're able to sign in and do that by just scanning a code. Pair the device, so to speak, initially. The music in my ears, it means we're out of time. I thank you for joining us. We record the show every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central. You can listen to it live at AskNoahShow.com. Can't make it? That's fine. Head over to podcast.AskNoahShow.com. There you'll not only find the articles and references we use to make the show, but the entire back catalog. Follow us on Twitter. I'm at Colonel Linux. He's at Linux Evans. We're back next week. This is the Ask Noah Show.